and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Nyambura and this is 100 on Books. So today I'm going to try and do my February 2023 wrap up. The key word here is try because unlike some people on BookTube who take really good notes as they're reading, or at least go to Goodreads and write a review, I did neither, and I read more than one book. So nitakuwa nafanya guesswork. I'll be doing some guesswork here. Not really guesswork, but I could give you more, but I might not have more. So let's get into it. The first book I finished in February was Vagabonds by Elogosa Osunde, narrated by Aritopo Atautigba, the author, Ifeyinwa Unachuku, Obongjayar, and Sheila Chukwulozi. This was a hybrid read, so I listened to the audiobook as I read the ebook, and it was another one of those joint reads I have with MJ, who I've talked about before on this channel and whose Goodreads page I'll link below. So this is a series of interconnected short stories that are set mostly in Lagos, if I remember correctly, and they have like a queer theme running through them that is just really quite interesting and propulsive for the most part. I'm not going to lie, this was the 6th or 7th time I tried reading this book. I remember on release day I put a hold for it on it, English, and yeah, did not read it. So sometimes I found that it takes, say, being in a book club or doing a buddy read with somebody to get out of that comfort zone, and this was it for me. And I'm really, really glad that I just suggested this because I would not have read it till the end, but I didn't want to be that person who shows up to a conversation not having finished the book. And I enjoyed it. I'm going to post links to some of the short stories in the book downstairs, just so you get a feel of what the book is like. It has some fantastical elements, some magical realism, which I generally don't go in for, but I liked it. Am I going to necessarily start a fan club? I don't think so, but it was a good read. Next was Stories from the Tenants Downstairs by Siddiq Fofana. This was a book I saw around the bookish internet last year. It didn't really fly high, but it was sort of like a quiet rumble, so to speak. And again, interconnected short stories. So there's a theme here that feature these folks who are living in one building and their lives in and out of the building in the face of a changing neighborhood, which is to say, honestly, gentrification. So they're being pushed out of their neighborhood and they're all sort of coming to terms with what it means to no longer live here, to no longer have identities that are centered around being residents of this building. I've found from this book, Vagabonds, also If I Survive You, which I talked about in a previous episode, I like interconnected short stories. I like how you can dip in and out, but also how they set you up almost to succeed as a reader, and Lord knows I needed that. Next was Hell of a Book by Jason Mott, narrated by J.D. Jackson and Ronald Pitt. This I started at the in the very early days of January as I was on the bus from Kericho. If you remember, I talked about going to Kericho in a previous episode, and so when I was coming back, I started reading this, and it follows a writer as he's on a book tour for his book, whose title is Hell of a Book, and then there's a parallel storyline that involves this young black boy, and on some level, I was just like, what's going on here? What's going on here? But not in a bad way. It's just like, I want to keep listening to figure out what's going on here. And so when we find out how they're connected and how it's really a meditation on blackness and the literary world and the shootings of unarmed black men and boys and so on. And it can be really sad and heartbreaking at times, but it's such a fast-moving book and such an insightful book. It's definitely something I would want to read in print. Next, Run, Book 1 by John Lewis and Andrew Aiden, illustrated by Elle Fury and Nate Powell. This is the first of the books that come after the Match series by John Lewis, who was, a civil rights figure in the US, and then who went on to be, I'm going to say, a congressman. And so we follow him as he sort of comes to the end of his time within the civil rights group he had been in, and all the machinations that led to the end of that time, but also the process that leads to him running for office and so on. I think it's very easy for folks who are interested in liberation groups and so on to have this rosy picture and have this narrative that everybody loved each other, folks are just in it to win it and all of that stuff, and sometimes there was infighting and they didn't necessarily agree on their politics and so on. I think one of the things it got me thinking about was how the drama of men is like framed as political shenanigans and so on, and women are sidelined in the process, because even in the writing of this book, it's almost like, yes, there was this woman and there was that woman, but on the whole, it's very focused on men. And well, me, I had thoughts, but yeah, it also made me wonder why, for instance, these groups were so okay with, say, the one man being the one who leads these efforts for years and years and years on end. Like, how do you practice liberatory politics within liberation groups? Like, if only one person is leading all the time, if you're not, for instance, rotating your leadership or having a leadership that includes queer people, women, disabled people, etc, 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 and yes, sometimes that is the same person, because intersectionality, then what does it mean to have a liberation politics, to be in liberatory groups? So yeah, but it was interesting, and the illustrations were quite nice. So Life Among the Savages is Shirley Jackson narrating this part of her life where she moves from New York to a rural part of the US, somewhere on the US East Coast. Honestly, as I said, I'm not going to remember everything about the books I read. I'm just really trying to do this as a record of the books I read. And having her kids there, managing her household. Yeah, it's very slice of life, but also very enjoyable, like quite humorous. I enjoyed listening to it. Next, I listened to The Pharaohs by Namwali Sapel, narrated by Kristen Ariza, Ryan Vincent Anderson, and Dion Graham. This is a book that threw me for a loop. I actually said somewhere that it reminded me of trust exercises. I'm going to put the cover here because I cannot right now remember the author's name. And those times when the narrative starts in one way and you feel you have a handle on what's going on, and then further on in the book it shifts in another direction and you're like, oh, okay, do I lose sight of the thing I thought I knew? So this story follows this woman who lost her brother when she was a child. Originally, we think he drowned, or we get the impression that he drowned, but the story keeps shifting over time, and she also feels that she keeps seeing him. And you never quite know what is true. Like, is it that our narrator is an unreliable narrator? Is it that we have multiple narrators? Is it that this story happens in various ways? Also, what is the basis of this story being told? Because, for instance, at no point do we, for instance, get the sense that this woman has had like this breakdown or something where she's now telling multiple instances of this story. It really took me on a trip, but I enjoyed every part of it, so much so that I finally picked up The Old Drift by Namwali Sapel, which I'm going to speak about in a later video, just because I was like, oh, no, she was writing, okay? And as I said, I enjoyed every moment of it. The next book I read was 16 and Pregnant by Lala Thomas, which I heard about from Bookish Realm, from Ashley at Bookish Realm's channel. If I can find that video, I'll put a link below. And this follows two girls, one of whom finds out she's pregnant in her last year of high school, which I think Americans would call her senior year of high school, and her best friend, who she originally is afraid of, like telling she wants to keep her baby, but then she decides to stay pregnant. And her best friend also encounters like some reproductive decisions along the way, and I found how each of them was given room to handle these decisions so beautiful, because there's so often a narrative about what it means to be a teenage mom, what it means to make hard reproductive decisions at any point in one's life, and there was a lot of realness, to be honest. For instance, the girl who decides to keep her baby has a waste man for a boyfriend, and she has a hard time reconciling with the fact that, yeah, he might not be the most present dad or the most useful, person to co-parent with, and so on. And that's a hard pill to swallow at any age, whether you're 16, 17, or 27, or 37, or whatever. And I found it very accessible. Also, it's a sort of thing that a young person would find interesting to read. I sound so old right now, but you know what I mean. And I think it would also be a great start for some conversations. Next was Commute, an illustrated memoir of female shame by Erin Williams. Michael Nyambura. What is the problem here? What's with the memoirs? So I don't quite remember where I saw this recommended, and I was like, that looks interesting, because I might not have brought this up here, but I love to read as I commute, and people talk about, this might be different where you're from, but like buying a car is one of those, big achievements a lot of people reach for. For me, it's like, I'd have to listen to audiobooks all the time. When will I ever read? And I live in a country where there's really no public transportation system. We have something that's cobbled together. Anybody who lives in Kenya knows what I'm talking about. Your matatus, your buses, and things like those, but like nothing that's quite structured, that this bus or this train or whatever is going to arrive at this time or leave at this time, and especially like throughout the day and so on. So I thought to myself, let's see how this thing that I enjoy, commuting, acts as a medium for thinking about, as the subtitle suggests, female shame. And lots of people have talked about this on Goodreads, so there's no need for me to retread that ground, but I feel like sometimes people just need to seek help instead of writing books. Because we really spend a lot of the book with Williams like rehashing her sexual history, some of the relationships she's been in, but also generalizing these things that, to be honest, I sometimes feel are really about white womanhood. Like, no one sees you after a certain age, or not sexually appealing after a certain age. Or the thing you want to do is to be as hot and as sexually appealing as possible. You don't want to gain weight, because then you become invisibilized because of your fatness. Because while I know anybody who's been touched by the specter of whiteness, no, but what I mean seriously is that anybody who's been touched by anti-blackness knows that. And if you read, for instance, Sabina String's Fearing the Black Body, this is something she talks about really beautifully, so I highly recommend that book. There is something about hating fatness that is tied up with whiteness, because it is perceived as the condition of the other, where the other, especially in the American context, is the black body. And so it just felt like she hadn't really asked herself some questions before she went ahead and drew these things, and I was like, okay. So anyway, I think everybody can tell how much I did not love that book. The next book I finished was The Wall by Marlene Haushofer, translated from the German by Sean Whiteside and narrated by Kata Maza. Um, this book, this is another one I don't remember how I came upon it, but I feel like I wish I could remember because there's probably a story there. But this story follows, it's actually like the diary entries of a woman who has found herself behind the titular wall. So she can see people on the other side of the wall. It's not a physical wall, it's sort of like a barrier she cannot press up against. And she has this life where she has to make a life for herself, feed herself, figure out her clothing situation, tend to herself when she's ill. And so she considers life during this time. What does it mean to have to make your own food, to gorge yourself out on meat because you don't even have the means to, for instance, preserve it? But also thinking about all the ways in which she spent her time obsessing over certain things that no longer mean anything, and would life have been different if she'd had this perspective before she went behind the wall and so on. I listened to this very slowly, like from about say the 28th or the 29th of January, well into say mid-February, and I enjoyed every part. Like I'd just go for walks and listen to it and be like, what does it mean to live in the world, and what does it mean to, for instance, in her case, come into a situation like this in one's middle age, or like later years, when you're not necessarily so sprightly as to start this fresh life for yourself. But also what does life mean when one is alone, and there's a twist in the story that's tied to this idea of aloneness. Like, what does life mean when you're alone, and what is demanded of you, and what do we lose in no longer encountering each other? I mean, I would have loved to read this book with someone else, and I might pick it up just to be able to think about some of the ideas and some of the feelings it brought up for me. So if you're down to do that sort of thing, just let me know and we'll organize it. Next, I listened to Devon and Chris Plan a Wedding by Chancellor C. Higgins, narrated by Rebecca Lee. This is a book that follows the two titular characters as they embark on a reality show where they're supposed to successfully fake date, and if they're able to convince their families that they're going to go down the aisle, they're going to win some money. But of course, this being a romance novel, they fall in love. And it was just so beautiful to see two black women fall in love. So tick for queer romance, tick for sapphic romance, tick for, a stud who was being represented in a certain way, like with kindness and generosity to all of the characters involved, and also that there was Afro-Latinx representation, Afro-Latina representation. So it was just a very beautiful story. I feel like if I talk about it, I will ruin it, but I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, especially because these people are tackling some tough things, like the fear of homophobic family members, and navigating queerness in the social media age, coming out to one's family, to one's community, and so on, while also finding love and finding joy, which I really enjoyed. The next book I finished was Cabin Fever, The Harrowing Journey of a Cruise Ship at the Dawn of a Pandemic by Michael Smith and Jonathan Franklin. I picked this up. This one, I remember why I picked it up. I picked it up because I am determined. I'm recording this on March the 19th, and I am determined to win every single of those Kindle Challenge bookmarks. I'm going to put a link to the Kindle Challenge, so if in case you don't know what that's about, because I didn't know about it until this year, because I haven't also been using the Kindle app. This is the first year I'm using the Kindle app. I think I started using it late last year. But anyway, let's not lose sight of what we're talking about, Nyambura. Yes, and so I'm trying to, like Pokemon, catch them all. And one of them was to read a select set, at least one from a select set of books that Amazon recommends for 2022, and this was one of them. And so, what's the book about? As the subtitle suggests, it follows a cruise ship in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still in. We are still in. And so, as you may recall, like cruise ships were a site of massive infections in the early days of the pandemic, but also this felt like a story about capitalism. Like there were all of these people in various stages of decision making who were just like we could pass up some profits, or or we could let people risk their lives getting on these ships that we've told them are safe. And we see how, for instance, there's that upstairs, downstairs, above deck, below deck. Okay, I don't know ship stuff. This whole book, but yes, let's go with above deck, below deck. Dichotomy. I've been watching a few yacht videos with my brother. And so there's one where, very interestingly, we were able to go to the cruise quarters, and just as in this book, they were not the most spacious, the most elegant, despite having seen some of the staterooms upstairs that just looked so, like decadent. I don't know if that's the word to use in this context, but yeah, opulous, maybe? Opulent? English! I said opulous. Listen, opulous is not a new word. Opulous. Yeah, and so we see how capitalism meant that everybody lost out. The passengers, some of whom were basically at the brink of death, and some of whom died because of these decisions by management. The crew who didn't even have, for instance, Wi-Fi to contact their families because they were being charged extortionate prices for Wi-Fi that passengers were being offered for free, and so on. It's just like, y'all keep making all of these decisions just to be mean. Like, when people say the cruelty is the point, the cruelty is so much the point. But you see also how lobbying and all of these things happening in the US, where this particular cruise ship company is based, meant that they could get away with all of these decisions, and they could also palm off some people who were ill and so on to the state when they no longer had any chance of making a profit. And it was so disgusting, but also it was also really heartening to see how people can show up for each other, and to think about the power of people over profit. Lastly was Layla by Prayag Akbar, narrated by Tanya Rodriguez. So I borrowed this book from the Bookworm Gigiri. I think I've mentioned the Bookworm Gigiri the past, and if I haven't, I'll put a link to them below. And so I didn't actually pick it up myself. My friend Angela Muturi, who is a fantastic person all around, I'll put a link to something of hers below, maybe her Twitter or something, went to the bookshop, went to the library. Gosh, my brain is turning into a Spanish speaking brain, because libreria means something different. Like a libreria would be a bookshop, and a library is a biblioteca. Anyway, here we are. So she did a little video, and I saw this and I was like, oh, okay. The cover has praise from Camila Shamsi, who I've never read, but who I've read good things about, whose writing I've read good things about. And it says the book is intelligent, chilling, and deeply moving. And because, I don't know, I struggled to really get into it originally for whatever reason, I decided to look for an audiobook copy, and the only place that had it was Scribd. As you may recall, I have a link to 60 days free downstairs if that's something you'd be interested in. So I went back to Scribd, a place I hadn't been to since the early days of the pandemic, restarted my account, and listened to the audiobook. And it is such an odd book. So what is it about? And I mean, I feel like I probably will not do it justice if I don't just read what's at the back. Not the back, the inside flap. Every year on Layla's birthday, Shalini kneels by the wall of Purity One with a little yellow spade and scoops dry earth to make a pit for 2 candles, one each for herself and for Reese, the husband at her side, a shrine to a missing child. But as Shalini walks from the patch of grass where she held her vigil, the man beside her melts away. It is 16 years since her daughter was taken, snatched from her 3rd birthday party. That evening was the last time Shalini saw the 3 people she loves most dearly: her mother, her husband, her child. There are 32 candle stabs buried in that lawn, and Shalini believes her search is finally drawing to a close. When she finds Layla, she will return and dig up each one. And this book is pegged as an Indian, The Handmaid's Tale. And I don't know about that because if I remember correctly, The Handmaid's Tale didn't really tackle race. Correct me if I'm wrong. Well, this really talks about the religious and caste divides. Sorry, it is not really a video if I don't have these sniffles or the babes. But yeah, it talks about the religious and caste divides in India. And so what happens in the universe of the story is that Shalini, who's our main character, marries outside her caste and outside her religion, and this has profound implications on her life and her husband's life. And she comes from the sort of family that has pushed back on a system that's just starting while she's young, where people have to live with their own, whatever that means. So people are separated, as I said, by caste, by religion, and so on. But she falls in love across these lines and starts her life for herself in what she thinks is a safe place. But of course, in a world like this, no place is safe. And as with every, I find, good Indian novel, class comes into it too. Because, well, she has broken away from some of these mores and norms of her society. She's still classed in the sort of way that she, for instance, has a servant in her home and so on. And as time progresses, part of the way this caste and religious conflict shows up is poor people who are disproportionately, of a certain caste, rising up against people like herself. And so all of these things intermingle to lead to, as that segment I read showed, the loss of her husband and her daughter and her family as she knows it, really. And she's reduced to, a life she could never fathom for herself. And we follow her through all of these, like recollections of her life, but also moments when she tries to reclaim something of who she was. And it was just very harrowing at times, very sad, very heartbreaking, but so compelling also. And I will definitely be looking out for more work by this writer. So that's it. That's all the books I read in February. Some obviously I remembered better than others, and honestly, this is why we need to go back to the weekly roundup, because it's almost 2 months since I finished some of those books. So thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, and all of the good things, and I'll be seeing you soon. Bye.